Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the creaking wooden door of a medieval tavern, and trust me, you're going to want to step right back out again. Picture this. It's dawn in the year 1347, somewhere in rural England, and you've just pushed open the heavy oak door of what locals generously call the Prancing Pony. The smell hits you first, a concentrated assault of unwashed bodies, stale ale, with smoke, and something that might charitably be called meat, but could just as easily be yesterday's horse. Your modern sensibilities are already screaming, but you haven't even made it past the threshold yet. The dim interior reveals figures slumped over rough wooden tables, some snoring into pools of their own drool, others staring at you with the kind of interest that makes you wish you'd stayed home in your nice, sanitized 21st century. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll have stories to tell, assuming you live long enough to tell them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our little global community of insomniacs and history buffs come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hesitate at the doorway, already second-guessing every life choice that led you to this moment. The tavern keeper, a man whose hygiene standards would make a medieval pig farmer blush, looks up from wiping down what might generously be called a cup with what definitely cannot be called a clean rag. His teeth, or what remains of them, gleam yellow in the firelight as he grins at you. "Welcome, stranger," he booms, his voice cutting through the morning stupor of his established clientele. The greeting sounds friendly enough, but you notice his hand never strays far from the cudgel hanging at his belt. Customer service has a different meaning when your customers might literally try to murder you over a disputed ale tab. The tavern itself defies every romantic notion you've ever had about medieval hospitality. Forget the cozy, Disney-fied version with cheerful music and dancing peasants. This is the reality. Low, smoke-stained beams that seem designed to give anyone over 5'6" a concussion. Rushes on the floor that haven't been changed since the Norman conquest. And windows so small and grimy they barely qualify as holes in the wall. The fire in the central hearth belches smoke with the enthusiasm of a dragon with respiratory problems, filling the room with a haze that makes your eyes water and your throat burn. You realize that medieval people didn't just have to worry about the Black Death, they had to survive the taverns first. The architecture itself tells a story of priorities that would horrify any modern building inspector. The ceiling sags under the weight of centuries and neglect, creating a topographical map of water damage and structural failure. Every beam groans with the weight of too many years and too little maintenance, and you find yourself unconsciously ducking as you move deeper into the room. The walls, where you can see them through the smoke and shadows, are a patchwork of stone, timber, and what appears to be optimistic thinking. Medieval building codes were more like medieval building suggestions, and this place suggests that safety was never much of a consideration. Your fellow early morning patrons are a sight to behold, and not in a good way. There's a merchant in the corner whose clothes suggest he's either very successful or very good at robbing successful merchants. His purse jangles with each movement, which explains why 3 other patrons are watching him with the focused attention of cats observing a particularly plump mouse. At another table, a group of pilgrims huddles together, their religious medals and walking sticks marking them as either devout travelers or very committed con artists. Historians still argue whether medieval pilgrims were genuinely pious or just looking for an excuse to travel and drink. But judging by the way this group is already deep in their cups despite the early hour, you're leaning toward the latter theory. The serving mentioned, yes, they actually called them that because medieval people weren't big on political correctness, approaches your table with all the enthusiasm of someone heading to their own execution. Her dress, if you can call the collection of patched fabric and hope that covers her address, has seen better decades. She's probably about 25, which in medieval years makes her practically ancient. Life expectancy wasn't just low because of disease and warfare, it was low because places like this existed, and people had to frequent them to survive. Her feet are bare, black with dirt and Lord knows what else, and you realize that shoes are apparently a luxury item in this establishment. What'll it be? She asks, and you realize you're about to face your first major challenge. Ordering something that won't kill you. The menu, such as it exists, is entirely verbal and entirely terrifying. There's ale, always ale, because water will kill you faster than a sword through the chest. There's bread, which doubles as both food and building material, depending on how long it's been sitting around. And there's meat, though the animal of origin remains a mystery that even the cook seems reluctant to solve. You notice that nobody's asking about vegetarian options, partly because the concept doesn't exist yet, but mostly because anyone fancy enough to have dietary preferences would never set foot in a place like this. The truth about medieval taverns is that they were less about hospitality and more about survival. They existed because travel was dangerous, and sometimes sleeping with one eye open in a room full of strangers was preferable to sleeping with both eyes closed in a forest full of bandits. The tavern keeper wasn't running a business so much as operating a barely legal protection racket. You paid for your ale, your questionable food, and your spot by the fire, and in return, he promised not to rob you himself, though he made no guarantees about his other customers. You glance around and notice that conversation has died down since your arrival. Everyone's pretending not to stare while absolutely staring, and you realize you've made a crucial error. You look like you don't belong here. Your clothes are too clean, your posture too upright, your teeth too present. In a world where blending in can mean the difference between reaching your destination and becoming someone else's profit margin, you stick out like a vegetarian at a barbecue. The smart money says you should finish your drink quickly and leave, but the smarter money says you should have never come in the first place. The morning light filtering through those pathetic excuses for windows reveals details you wish it hadn't. The rushes on the floor aren't just old theory archaeological. Layers of straw, food scraps, bodily fluids, and things you don't want to identify have built up into what amounts to a medieval shag carpet of horrors. You can actually trace the seasons by the layers. Autumn leaves mixed with winter mud, spring floods leaving their mark, summer heat baking everything into an aromatic crust that defies description. The floor itself has become less of a surface and more of an ecosystem, complete with its own weather patterns and possibly its own form of primitive government. A fight breaks out near the fire, something about someone looking at someone else wrong, which is apparently a capital offense when you've been drinking since yesterday. The tavern keeper doesn't intervene so much as place bets on the outcome, and you begin to understand that conflict resolution here follows more of a survival of the fittest model than anything resembling modern justice. The victor staggers back to his seat, blood on his knuckles and pride intact, while the loser crawls away to lick his wounds and plot revenge. Just another Tuesday morning in medieval hospitality. The noise level in the tavern creates its own unique symphony of human misery. There's the constant background hum of conversations conducted in languages you can't identify, punctuated by the occasional crash of crockery, the thud of bodies hitting furniture, and the less identifiable sounds that you're choosing to ignore for your own sanity. Someone in the back corner is singing what might charitably be called a song, though it sounds more like a cat being slowly strangled by someone with a decent sense of rhythm. The Pilgrims have started a drinking song that's heavy on enthusiasm and light on musical talent, and you realize that medieval entertainment had very different standards than your Spotify playlist. You notice that the tavern operates on a complex social hierarchy that makes high school cafeterias look egalitarian. The merchant with the jingling purse gets the best seat by the fire and the cleanest cup, while the obvious peasants huddle near the door where the drafts hit hardest. The pilgrims occupy a middle ground, respected for their supposed holiness but watched carefully for signs of fraud. And then there's you, the obvious outsider, treated with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that suggests your presence here is either a terrible mistake or the setup for a very expensive joke. The economic reality of tavern life becomes apparent as you watch transactions unfold. Payment is negotiated rather than standardized, with the tavern keeper's mood, the customer's apparent wealth, and the current political situation all factoring into the final price. You see a farmer pay for his ale with what appears to be a live chicken, while a traveling tinker offers to repair pots in exchange for a meal. Medieval currency was more of a suggestion than a standard, and bartering was often the only way to conduct business, especially when dealing with people whose coin might be clipped, counterfeit, or stolen. The ventilation system, if you can dignify it with such a modern term, consists entirely of the gaps between the boards and whatever fresh air can fight its way past the smoke, steam, and general atmospheric density. You find yourself breathing through your mouth to avoid the full olfactory experience. But this only introduces new flavors that your taste buds weren't designed to process. The air itself has achieved a consistency that's almost chewable, a mixture of smoke, steam, human exhalation, and substances that would make a modern air quality monitor simply give up and display an error message. You're starting to realize that your romantic notions of medieval life were about as accurate as expecting your local McDonald's to serve wine in golden chalices. This isn't the charming rustic experience you imagine at it's a crash course in why modern civilization, for all its flaws, represents a massive upgrade in basically every conceivable way. And you haven't even tried to eat anything yet. The morning sun climbs higher outside, promising a full day of medieval hospitality that will test every assumption you've ever had about the good old days. Spoiler alert, they weren't that good. The iron manacles clamp around your wrists with a finality that echoes through the stone corridors of the manor house. You're no longer just an accused peasantry officially property of the crown, or in this case, your local lord's justice system. The guards who now control your immediate future are a motley crew of men who found employment in one of medieval society's few growth industries, human misery management. They grunt instructions in a dialect you can barely understand, punctuated with shoves and the occasional crack of a leather whip against stone walls to keep you moving forward. The sound reverberates through the corridors like a promise of what's to come. Your journey to prison begins with what medieval authorities euphemistically called transportation, though it bears no resemblance to any modern concept of humane prisoner transfer. You're chained not just at the wrists, but also at the ankles, with heavy iron links that force you to shuffle rather than walk normally. The weight of the metal is immediately exhausting, and you haven't even left the manor grounds yet. These aren't the clean, precisely fitted restraints you might see in movies theory crude iron bands that were hammered into shape by the village blacksmith, with rough edges that immediately begin abrading your skin. The metal is cold against your flesh, and you can already feel the beginning of what will become permanent scars. The chain gang you're about to join is already assembled in the manor's courtyard, a sorry collection of humanity that represents the bottom tier of medieval society. There's a poacher who allegedly killed one of the lord's deer, his face bearing the marks of a recent beating. A woman accused of adultery stands with her head bowed, her hair roughly shorn as part of her preliminary punishment. An old man whose debts to the local miller have finally caught up with him wheezes with each breath, clearly in poor health. A young boy who couldn't have been more than 14, charged with stealing apples from a monastery orchard, looks around with wide, terrified eyes. You're chained together like a human freight train, each person's movement affecting everyone else in the line. Medieval prisoner transport was a public spectacle designed to serve multiple purposes beyond simply moving bodies from point A to point B. The authorities wanted everyone to see what happened to people who broke the rules, creating a mobile morality play that would hopefully deter other potential criminals. Your slow parade through the village streets becomes an impromptu carnival of public shame, with townspeople gathering to witness your humiliation and remind themselves how much worse their own lives could become. It's like being the star of a reality show that nobody wants to watch, but everyone feels compelled to observe. The crowd that assembles to watch your procession is surprisingly diverse, representing nearly every social class except the nobility, who are presumably too refined to engage in such crude entertainment. Merchants abandon their stalls, craftsmen set down their tools, and even priests emerge from churches to observe the wages of sin being displayed in living color. Children are lifted onto parents' shoulders for better views, as if this were some sort of twisted holiday parade celebrating the triumph of justice over lawlessness. The medieval equivalent of going viral, except instead of getting famous, you're getting pelted with garbage. The projectiles begin flying almost immediately. Rotten vegetables are the ammunition of choice, though you quickly discover that medieval crowds aren't particularly picky about what they throw at condemned prisoners. Spoiled eggs explode against your face and clothing, filling your nostrils with the sulfurous stench of decay. Moldy bread bounces off your shoulders, while kitchen scraps and animal waste create a slippery mess around your shuffling feet. One particularly enterprising spectator has brought a basket of turnips that have gone soft with age, launching them with surprising accuracy at your head. Another throws what you hope is mud but suspect might be something considerably worse. The guards make no effort to protect you from this baragine fact. They seem to encourage it by slowing the procession whenever the crowd gets particularly enthusiastic about their target practice. This isn't just transportation. It's the first installment of your punishment, a public humiliation designed to strip away whatever dignity you might have retained from your brief trial. You're learning that medieval justice believed in getting its money's worth from every convicted criminal, like buying a torture package deal with multiple components included at no extra charge. The woman chained next to you, the one convicted of adultery, whispers that she's made this journey before. Apparently, medieval justice sometimes involved multiple public shaming sessions for repeat offenders, with each subsequent trip featuring escalating levels of community participation. She warns you to keep your mouth shut and your head down, advice that seems eminently practical given the current circumstances. Her face bears scars that suggest previous crowds were even less restrained than today's audience. She also mentions that the prison you're heading to has a reputation that makes grown men weep, though she doesn't elaborate on the details. Your route takes you through the village's main thoroughfare, past the market square where you've purchased goods for your family in happier times. The same merchants who once smiled and exchanged pleasantries when you had coins to spend now watch your passage with expressions ranging from smugness to pity. The baker whose bread you allegedly stole, though you've never stolen anything in your life, stands in his doorway with his arms crossed, nodding with satisfaction at what he probably sees as long overdue justice. His wife stands beside him, shaking her head as if she'd predicted this outcome all along. The physical toll of this journey is immediately apparent. The iron shackles create a shuffling gait that's both exhausting and humiliating, forcing you to take tiny steps while trying to coordinate your movement with the other prisoners in your chain gang. The weight of the metal pulls constantly at your wrists and ankles, creating a burning sensation that you know will only get worse as the miles accumulate. Medieval metallurgy wasn't particularly concerned with prisoner comfort, and these restraints were designed for security rather than wearability. The chains connecting you to your fellow prisoners are just long enough to allow movement but short enough to ensure that any attempt at independent action affects everyone else in the line. As you shuffle through the village outskirts, the crowd begins to thin, though dedicated followers continue trailing your procession like medieval paparazzi documenting a celebrity scandal. Some of them carry crude musical instruments, drums, flutes, and rattles, creating a discordant soundtrack for your journey that transforms the entire experience into a nightmarish festival. It's like being the unwilling star of the world's worst parade, complete with a marching band that's tone-deaf and malicious. Children run alongside the procession, chanting rhymes about prisoners and thieves that suggest this sort of entertainment has inspired its own folk traditions. The road to the regional prison is little more than a muddy track that becomes increasingly treacherous as your group moves farther from civilization. Medieval infrastructure was notoriously poor, with most roads being simple dirt paths that turned into swamps whenever it rained. Your shuffling progress kicks up clouds of dust that mix with the rotting vegetables still clinging to your clothes, creating a paste-like substance that makes breathing difficult and visibility poor. The guards occasionally crack their whips over your heads to maintain pace, though at the speed you're capable of moving, their urgency seems somewhat misplaced. Medieval prisoner transport typically took place during daylight hours for security reasons, but this meant you were exposed to whatever weather conditions happened to prevail during your journey. If it rained, you got soaked to the bone while trudging through mud that made walking even more difficult. If the sun shone brightly, you roasted in your heavy clothing and iron restraints with no protection from the heat. Today seems determined to provide you with the full medieval weather experience, alternating between light drizzle and humid sunshine that creates a personal climate of maximum discomfort. The guards have cloaks and hats. You have chains and misery. Historians still argue whether these public spectacles actually deterred crime or simply provided entertainment for populations that had few other diversions available. What's clear is that the practice served important social functions, allowing communities to collectively express their disapproval of antisocial behavior while reinforcing shared values about property, authority, and moral conduct. You've become a living lesson in social studies, though probably not the kind you would have volunteered for. The irony isn't lost on you that your alleged crime-stealing grain was probably motivated by the same poverty that's now making your punishment a source of entertainment for people who have nothing better to do. The guards accompanying your procession are a study in medieval law enforcement efficiency, which is to say they're about as professional as a group of tavern bouncers who've been drinking on the job. They carry an assortment of weapons clubs, short swords, and crossbows, but seem more interested in chatting among themselves than monitoring their prisoners. One of them periodically counts heads to make sure nobody has somehow escaped while chained to a dozen other people, displaying the kind of thoroughness that probably explains why medieval crime rates were actually pretty manageable. Their conversation topics range from complaints about their wages to detailed descriptions of what they plan to do with various tavern wenches, creating a running commentary that would be inappropriate in any professional setting. Halfway through your journey, the procession stops at a roadside tavern where the guards decide they need refreshment. You and your fellow prisoners are left standing in the courtyard, still chained together, while your captors disappear inside for what sounds like an increasingly boisterous drinking session. The tavern keeper's wife takes pity on your group and brings out a bucket of water and a ladle, allowing each prisoner a few precious sips. It's the first kindness you've experienced since this ordeal began, and you find yourself almost weeping with gratitude for this small gesture of humanity. She also provides a crust of bread for each prisoner, though she's careful to avoid eye contact and whispers that she could get in trouble for showing mercy to condemned criminals. The delay gives you time to really look at your fellow prisoners and contemplate the randomness of medieval justice. The old debtor explains that he owes money to 3 different creditors and can't possibly pay them all, making prison his only refuge from demands he can never meet. The young apple thief turns out to be an orphan who was simply trying to eat something after going 3 days without food. The poacher killed a deer to feed his sick wife, knowing full well that the penalty could be severe but calculating that watching her starve was worse than risking imprisonment. The adulteress claims her husband arranged her conviction to get rid of her without paying for a divorce, though medieval divorce laws were so complicated that her story is entirely plausible. These aren't hardened criminals or dangerous sociopaths. They're ordinary people who made desperate choices or simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when authorities needed someone to blame for various problems. Medieval society created the conditions that drove people to these acts, then punished them severely for responding to those conditions in predictable ways. It's like deliberately creating a maze with no exit, then condemning the rats for getting lost. The system seems designed to produce criminals rather than prevent crime, ensuring a steady supply of prisoners to fill the expanding network of medieval detention facilities. When the guards finally emerge from the tavern, they're noticeably less steady on their feet but no less enthusiastic about completing their mission. The remainder of your journey takes on a surreal quality as your slightly drunk escorts alternately sing tavern songs and shout threats at anyone who might be thinking about attempting an escape. Not that escape seems particularly feasible when you're chained to 11 other people and moving at roughly the speed of continental drift. One guard has apparently won money gambling and celebrates by occasionally tossing coins at beggars along the roadside, a display of generosity that stands in stark contrast to his treatment of the prisoners under his care. The countryside through which you're traveling becomes increasingly desolate as you move farther from populated areas. Medieval prisons were typically located in remote locations for security reasons, but this isolation also served to reinforce the sense that prisoners were being removed from civilized society entirely. The landscape consists mainly of scrubland and rocky outcroppings that provide little in the way of comfort or beauty. Occasional ravens follow your procession, as if they've learned to associate these prisoner transports with future feeding opportunities. The afternoon sun beats down mercilessly, and the combination of heavy iron restraints, rotting food residue, and accumulated sweat creates a personal atmosphere that would challenge even medieval standards of hygiene. Your fellow prisoners are suffering similarly, with several showing signs of heat exhaustion and dehydration. The guards seem oblivious to these health concerns, maintaining their pace regardless of whether their charges are capable of keeping up. Medieval prisoner transport operated on the assumption that anyone strong enough to commit crimes was strong enough to survive punishment, regardless of evidence to the contrary. As evening approaches, you begin to understand that this journey serves purposes beyond simple transportation. The physical exhaustion, public humiliation, and gradual removal from familiar surroundings all combine to break down your psychological defenses and prepare you for what lies ahead. By the time you reach the prison, you'll already be softened up for whatever horrors await inside those stone walls. It's like a conditioning process designed to transform free citizens into compliant prisoners before they even enter their cells. The prison finally comes into view as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, a massive stone structure that dominates the landscape like a man-made mountain of despair. Even from a distance, you can see that this isn't just a building, it's a statement about power, authority, and what happens to people who challenge the established order. The walls rise from the earth like cliffs, with small windows that look more like arrow slits than any concession to prisoner comfort or human needs. Smoke rises from various points within the complex, though whether from cooking fires or more sinister purposes isn't immediately clear. Your arrival at the prison gates marks the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. The guards pound on heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands, creating echoes that seem to reverberate from deep within the stone walls. When the doors finally swing open, they reveal a courtyard that looks like something from your worst dreams, a space where sunlight struggles to reach the ground and shadows seem to have weight and substance. The smell that emerges from within is indescribable, a mixture of human waste, decay, and despair that makes the rotting vegetables still clinging to your clothes seem almost pleasant by comparison. As the morning sun climbs higher and your questionable breakfast settles uneasily in your stomach, the tavern begins to fill with its regular cast of characters, and you quickly realize that colorful doesn't begin to describe this crowd. The first to catch your attention is old Henrik, a grizzled veteran of something, though whether it's warfare, agriculture, or just staying alive this long remains unclear. He's missing an eye, 3 fingers, and most of his teeth, but he's gained a repertoire of stories that would make a medieval bard weep with envy. Henrik settles into his usual spot by the fire and immediately begins holding court, his voice carrying the authority of someone who's survived things that killed better men. Back in my day, Henrik begins, which you quickly learn is how every story starts. We didn't have fancy glass windows like these here. He gestures toward the tavern's tiny, grimy openings that barely qualify as windows. You realize that if these count as fancy, Henrik's standards were forged in some truly dark times. His stories flow like ale from a broken barrel constantly, messily, and with questionable accuracy. He regales the growing crowd with tales of battles that may or may not have happened, featuring armies that probably never existed, all delivered with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing your audience has no way to fact-check medieval military history. Henrik's physical appearance tells its own story of medieval survival against impossible odds. His missing eye socket has healed into a permanent wink that gives him an oddly conspiratorial air, while his remaining fingers show the kind of wear that comes from decades of manual labor in an age when workplace safety was a concept that wouldn't be invented for several centuries. His clothes, patched and repatched until they're more thread than original fabric, speak to a life lived on the absolute edge of survival. Yet here he sits, ale in hand, dispensing wisdom and misinformation with equal enthusiasm to anyone willing to listen. The pilgrims at the corner table provide their own entertainment value, though unintentionally. They've claimed to be traveling to Canterbury, but their knowledge of religious customs suggests they've spent more time in taverns than churches. One of them, Brother Marcus, and you're using brother very loosely here, attempts to lead the group in prayer before realizing he's forgotten most of the words. His improvised Latin sounds suspiciously like he's just adding random syllables to regular English words, creating a religious experience that would horrify actual clergy. The other pilgrims nod along piously, either too drunk to notice or too committed to the con to break character. Brother Marcus himself is a masterpiece of medieval imposture. His monk's robes, clearly purchased from someone who either died or abandoned their calling, fit him about as well as a tent fits a scarecrow. His tonsure-wreath circular bald patch that marked medieval clergy appears to have been achieved through creative hair cutting rather than religious dedication, and his knowledge of scripture seems limited to whatever fragments he's overheard in other taverns. Yet he maintains his charade with the dedication of a true artist, blessing ale cups with made-up prayers and offering spiritual guidance that sounds suspiciously like common sense dressed up in religious language. A new arrival stumbles through the door, and the entire tavern's energy shifts like a pack of wolves scenting fresh meat. This is William the Miller, and his appearance suggests his recent journey involved more falling down than walking. His clothes are caked with mud, flour, and substances you'd rather not identify, while his face bears the kind of bruising that speaks to recent disagreements about grain prices. William owes money to half the people in this tavern and favors to the other half, making him simultaneously the most popular and most unwelcome guest of the morning. William's profession marks him as one of medieval society's essential but universally distrusted figures. Millers controlled the machinery that turned grain into flour, making them indispensable to everyone who wanted to eat bread that didn't require archaeological excavation to consume. But their monopoly on milling also made them natural targets for suspicion. Everyone knew millers skimmed grain from every sack they processed, but proving it was nearly impossible. William's current prosperity, evidenced by his jingling purse, could come from legitimate business success or from the kind of creative accounting that medieval millers had perfected into an art form. "Friends," William announces with the forced cheer of a man who knows his creditors are watching. "Drinks for everyone." The enthusiasm in the room is immediate, but cautious medieval people understood that free drinks usually came with expensive complications. You watch as William produces a purse that jingles with suspicious prosperity, given his recently impoverished status. The tavern keeper eyes him with the wariness of someone who's seen too many deals go wrong. But gold is gold, even when its provenance raises questions that nobody really wants answered. The reaction to William's generosity reveals the complex social mathematics of medieval tavern life. The obvious peasants surge forward with the enthusiasm of people who rarely see free anything, while the merchant maintains his dignity by accepting the offer with calculated grace. The pilgrims debate among themselves whether accepting drinks from a possibly corrupt miller compromises their spiritual mission, a theological discussion that ends quickly when the serving wench arrives with full cups. Everyone understands that William's sudden wealth will require explanation eventually, but medieval etiquette demands that such questions wait until after the free drinks are consumed. The entertainment escalates when Crazy Mary shuffles in from whatever hovel she calls home. Mary's approach to personal hygiene makes the other patrons look fastidious by comparison, and her fashion sense appears to have been influenced by scarecrows and desperation. She's the tavern's unofficial prophet, dispensing predictions that range from reasonably accurate weather forecasting to completely unhinged rants about the coming apocalypse. Today she's predicting that the king will die within a fortnight, a prediction she makes roughly once a week, operating on the medieval principle that eventually she'll be right, and everyone will remember her as a visionary rather than a lunatic. Mary's prophetic method involves a complex system of signs and portents that would impress modern conspiracy theorists with its elaborate interconnectedness. The flight patterns of local birds, the behavior of barnyard animals, the dreams of various tavern patrons, and the price of grain all factor into her predictions with the kind of mathematical precision that would be impressive if it wasn't completely insane. Her accuracy rate hovers around what you'd expect from random chance, but her delivery is so convincing that even skeptical patrons find themselves unconsciously checking the sky for unusual bird activity. Mark my words, Mary cackles, pointing a finger that hasn't seen soap since the Crusades. The ravens are gathering in the east, and when ravens gather, kingdoms fall. Her audience nods with the kind of respectful attention that medieval people reserved for the obviously insane, partly out of superstition and partly because crazy people sometimes knew things that sane people missed. Historians still argue whether medieval holy fools possessed genuine insight or just the kind of random wisdom that comes from having nothing left to lose, but Mary's track record suggests she's operating more on luck than divine revelation. The social dynamics of the tavern become increasingly apparent as the morning progresses. There's a strict but unspoken hierarchy that governs everything from seating arrangements to speaking order. The merchant maintains his position near the fire through a combination of coin and implied threat, while the obvious peasants cluster near the door where the drafts hit hardest. The pilgrims occupy a middle ground, their claimed religious status earning them a grudging respect that's constantly undermined by their obviously secular behavior. And hovering over everything is the tavern keeper, maintaining order through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and strategic deployment of his cudgel. This hierarchy extends to conversation privileges as well. Old Henrik's war stories command respectful silence, while the peasants' attempts at humor are met with polite tolerance at best. The merchants' opinions on trade and politics are received as gospel truth, regardless of their actual accuracy, while Crazy Mary's prophecies are heard with the kind of attention usually reserved for natural disasters, fascinating but potentially dangerous. Even seating follows unwritten rules that everyone understands but nobody discusses, creating a medieval version of assigned seating that's enforced through social pressure rather than formal authority. A group of traveling entertainers bursts through the door with the kind of theatrical flair that medieval people either loved or immediately distrusted, depending on their recent experiences with con artists. This particular troupe consists of a minstrel whose lute has seen better centuries, a juggler whose skills appear to be limited to objects that won't cause serious injury when dropped, and a storyteller whose repertoire seems heavily influenced by whatever audience will pay for drinks. They survey the tavern with the practiced eye of performers calculating their potential earnings against their likely survival chances. The minstrel, who introduces himself as Melodious Martin, with the kind of confidence that suggests he's never heard himself sing, represents the bottom tier of medieval entertainment. His lute, held together with wire, hope, and what appears to be tree sap, produces sounds that would make cats flee in terror. His repertoire consists entirely of songs about brave knights and beautiful ladies, but his delivery transforms epic ballads into what sounds like a wounded animal's final moments. The audience listens with the kind of polite attention that medieval people reserved for entertainment they couldn't afford to offend, knowing that insulted performers had a tendency to spread unflattering stories about their hosts. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martin announces, apparently operating under a very liberal definition of both terms. "Prepare to be amazed by feats of musical mastery and tales of wonder." His lute produces sounds that suggest it's crying for help, while his singing voice achieves notes that make the tavern's chickens stop laying eggs. The juggler begins his routine with wooden balls, quickly realizing that the low ceiling and his limited skills make for a dangerous combination. Objects begin raining down on the audience with the unpredictability of a medieval siege, causing patrons to duck and weave like they're under actual attack. The juggler, known as Dexterous Dan despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, has clearly learned his trade through trial and error, with heavy emphasis on the error. His attempts at juggling 3 balls quickly devolve into an elaborate game of catch with an audience that didn't volunteer to participate. The low ceiling beams serve as additional obstacles, turning his performance into a combination of entertainment and architectural hazard assessment. Patrons in the front row develop the kind of reflexes typically associated with combat veterans, ducking and weaving to avoid projectiles while maintaining the polite applause expected of a civilized audience. The storyteller takes over with a tale that begins promisingly enough, something about a brave knight and a beautiful princess, but quickly devolves into a rambling narrative that incorporates elements from every story he's ever heard, creating a medieval mashup that would confuse even the most dedicated fantasy enthusiast. His knight battles dragons that transform into windmills, rescues princesses who turn out to be witches, and travels through kingdoms that seem to change their political systems mid-sentence. The audience listens with the kind of polite attention that suggests they're calculating whether the entertainment value justifies the inevitable request for payment. Meanwhile, a heated discussion breaks out between 2 farmers about the proper way to predict next year's harvest. A debate that quickly escalates from agricultural theory to personal insults to what appears to be preparations for physical violence. Medieval farming was serious business. Crop failure meant starvation, so discussions about planting schedules carried the weight of life and death decisions. These particular farmers have clearly been arguing about soil preparation since before the wheel was invented, and their debate touches on everything from lunar cycles to the sexual habits of various farm animals, all delivered with the passion of men whose livelihoods depend on getting dirt to cooperate. The agricultural debate reveals the deep superstitions that governed medieval farming practices. One farmer swears by planting according to moon phases, while the other insists that the key is observing the behavior of earthworms. Their argument encompasses everything from the proper blessing of seeds to the most effective methods of cursing competitors' crops, creating a discussion that blends science, superstition, and outright fantasy with the kind of confidence that only comes from complete ignorance of actual agricultural principles. The other patrons take sides based on personal loyalty rather than expertise, turning a farming discussion into the kind of factional dispute that could split the tavern into warring camps. The tavern's resident philosopher, a man known simply as Deep Thoughts Robert, chooses this moment to share his latest insights about the nature of existence. Robert's philosophical training appears to consist entirely of staring into his ale cup until inspiration strikes, which explains why his insights tend toward the obvious rather than the profound. Today, he's exploring the relationship between ale consumption and spiritual enlightenment, a topic that allows him to combine his 2 favorite activities, drinking and talking about drinking. His audience pretends to listen while actually focusing on more pressing concerns, like whether William the Miller's mysterious prosperity will extend to another round of drinks. Robert's philosophical method involves making increasingly abstract statements about increasingly concrete subjects until his listeners lose track of what he's actually talking about. His current lecture on the spiritual properties of fermented grain manages to combine elements of alchemy, theology, and wishful thinking into a coherent system that explains everything while proving nothing. The other patrons nod along with the kind of respectful attention that medieval people reserved for anyone who could make nonsense sound profound, knowing that arguing with philosophers was even more pointless than arguing with farmers. A fight nearly breaks out when someone suggests that the local lord's latest tax increases are reasonable, a statement so controversial it brings conversation to a complete halt. Medieval taxation was a topic that could turn friendly neighbors into mortal enemies, partly because the tax system made modern bureaucracy look efficient and fair by comparison. The suggestion that anyone might willingly pay more taxes causes such an uproar that the tavern keeper has to physically step between potential combatants, wielding his cudgel with the practiced ease of someone who's settled many similar disagreements. The taxation debate reveals the complex relationship between medieval peasants and their feudal overlords. Everyone understands that taxes are necessary for maintaining armies, building roads, and funding the kind of luxurious lifestyle that lords consider essential to proper governance. But the actual collection of these taxes follows a system so arbitrary and corrupt that it makes modern tax codes look like models of simplicity and fairness. The suggestion that these taxes might be reasonable strikes the assembled peasants as the kind of heretical thinking that could undermine the entire social order, assuming there was a social order to undermine rather than just a complex system of mutual exploitation. The morning's social experiment continues as new arrivals filter in, each adding their own flavor to the tavern's increasingly volatile mixture. There's a blacksmith whose personal hygiene suggests he's been working very close to very hot fires, a traveling merchant whose goods appear to consist entirely of items that might charitably be called questionable, and a woman whose profession remains diplomatically unspecified, but whose business seems to be thriving despite the early hour. Each new arrival shifts the tavern's social chemistry, creating alliances and rivalries that form and dissolve with the speed of medieval politics. You realize that medieval taverns functioned as more than just eating and drinking establishments. They were social media platforms, news networks, and entertainment centers all rolled into one institution that would horrify modern health inspectors. Every conversation carries multiple layers of meaning. Every interaction has potential consequences, and everyone's watching everyone else for signs of weakness, opportunity, or free drinks, and you're sitting in the middle of it all, increasingly aware that your clean clothes and obvious outsider status make you either a target or an opportunity, depending on who's doing the evaluating. The morning is still young, and already you're beginning to understand why medieval people had such short life expectancy. It wasn't just the diseases and warfare. It was the social stress of trying to survive in a world where everyone was potentially dangerous and definitely desperate. The topic of hygiene emerges organically when one of the pilgrims, apparently overcome by the morning's drinking, stumbles toward what you generously assume is the tavern's washing area. You follow his unsteady progress with morbid curiosity, wondering what medieval people considered adequate personal maintenance. What you discover redefines your understanding of human adaptability and makes you grateful for every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted. The washing station consists of a wooden basin filled with water that appears to have serviced the entire tavern for the past week, possibly month. The liquid's original clear nature has evolved into something resembling thin mud, complete with floating debris that you choose not to examine too closely. Brother Marcus, still maintaining his questionable religious persona, approaches the basin with the reverence typically reserved for holy relics. He dips his hands into the murky water and performs what can only be described as a ceremonial gesture rather than actual cleaning. His face receives similar treatment, though the result suggests he's redistributed dirt rather than removed it. The towel hanging nearby has achieved a level of collective use that makes it more of a disease-spreading mechanism than a drying implement. But Marcus applies it to his face with the satisfaction of someone who believes he's achieved peak cleanliness. The towel itself tells its own story of medieval hygiene, originally perhaps white or tan. It's now achieved a mottled brown-gray that speaks to countless encounters with unwashed faces and hands. Medieval attitudes toward bathing reveal a complex relationship with water that would puzzle modern hygienists. The prevailing medical wisdom suggested that too much washing opened the pores to disease-causing vapors, making cleanliness not just unnecessary but potentially dangerous. Water was viewed with suspicion if it wasn't safe to drink. How could it be safe to bathe in? The logical medieval mind concluded that a light coating of protective grime was preferable to the risks associated with excessive cleaning. This philosophy explained why the assembled tavern patrons wore their dirt like armor, layered and protective against the invisible threats that medieval medicine insisted lurked in cleanliness. The medical theories underlying medieval hygiene practices were based on the concept of humoral balance, where the bodies for humor's blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile needed to remain in equilibrium for optimal health. Washing was believed to disrupt this delicate balance by removing protective oils and opening pores to corrupting influences. Medieval physicians recommended limiting bathing to no more than once or twice per year, and only then with careful preparation involving herbs, prayers, and astrological consultation. The result was a society that had developed elaborate justifications for what was essentially a practical response to the difficulty of maintaining cleanliness in a world without modern plumbing or affordable soap. Old Henrik demonstrates the medieval approach to dental care when he produces what appears to be a small stick and begins working it between his remaining teeth. Medieval toothbrushes, such as they were, consisted of frayed twigs or rough cloth used to dislodge food particles and, hopefully, some of the accumulated plaque. Henrik's technique involves aggressive scraping that produces alarming sounds and occasional bleeding, but he continues with the determination of someone who understands that tooth loss is inevitable but still worth fighting. His breath, even from across the room, carries the complex aroma of decay, and whatever herbs medieval people believed promoted oral health. The medieval approach to dental hygiene was based more on hope than science, combining folk remedies with techniques that often caused more harm than good. Henrik's tooth cleaning stick, made from a birch twig that's been chewed to create a crude brush, represents the height of medieval dental technology. The process involves vigorously scrubbing teeth with whatever abrasive materials were available, often including salt, crushed herbs, or even ground bone. The goal wasn't the pristine whiteness that modern people expect, but simply maintaining enough tooth structure to continue eating solid food. Medieval dental care also involved elaborate rituals designed to prevent tooth worms, mythical creatures that medieval people believed caused cavities by boring holes in teeth. The serving wench's personal hygiene routine becomes apparent as she moves around the tavern, leaving a trail of scents that tell the story of medieval working life. Her hair, bound in what was probably once a clean cloth, has achieved the kind of greasy sophistication that only comes from weeks without proper washing. Medieval people believed that hair washing should be limited to prevent the scalp from becoming too sensitive, a theory that conveniently aligned with the practical difficulties of heating water and finding soap. Her approach to hair maintenance involves occasional rebraiding and the hopeful application of various aromatic herbs that fight a losing battle against accumulated oils and tavern smoke. Medieval hair care involved techniques that would mystify modern stylists with their combination of neglect and elaborate ritual. The serving wench's hair routine includes the careful application of various oils and herbs believed to promote hair health while masking the inevitable odors of unwashed scalp. Medieval people understood that hair was both a mark of beauty and a practical concern. Long hair could harbor lice, dirt, and other unwanted guests, but cutting it too short violated social expectations about feminine appearance. The result was elaborate hairstyles designed to contain and control unwashed hair while maintaining the illusion of proper grooming. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely unaware of the connection between cleanliness and health or simply resigned to living within the constraints of their water-poor, soap-scarce environment. The evidence suggests a combination of both. Medical texts warned against excessive bathing, while practical manuals offered advice on maintaining cleanliness within acceptable limits. The result was a society that had developed elaborate workarounds for basic hygiene, creating systems of maintenance that prioritize survival over comfort and functionality over aesthetics. The medieval soap industry, such as it existed, produced harsh alkaline soaps made from animal fat and wood ash that were expensive, difficult to obtain, and potentially damaging to skin. Most people made do with sand, rough cloth, or various plant materials for cleaning, creating a personal hygiene system that was more about removing the most obvious dirt than achieving actual cleanliness. The serving wench's occasional use of soap represents a luxury that many tavern patrons could never afford, making her relative cleanliness a mark of either prosperity or professional necessity. William the Miller provides a masterclass in occupational hygiene when he attempts to clean flour from his clothes using nothing but vigorous brushing and optimistic thinking. Medieval millers lived in a constant cloud of grain dust that penetrated every fiber of their being, creating a professional identity that was literally worn on the sleeve. William's clothes have achieved a permanent flour coating that's become integral to the fabric structure. Removing it would probably cause the garments to disintegrate entirely. His hair, eyebrows, and even his eyelashes carry traces of his profession, making him look like he's been lightly dusted for some cosmic baking project. The occupational hazards of medieval milling extended beyond simple dust accumulation to include the constant exposure to grain mites, weevils, and various molds that thrived in stored grain. William's attempts at personal cleaning involve techniques specifically designed to deal with flour dust, including specialized brushes and scraping tools that remove the heaviest accumulations while accepting that complete cleanliness is impossible. Medieval millers developed their own hygiene protocols that balanced professional necessity with social expectations, creating a unique approach to personal maintenance that other professions couldn't understand or replicate. The tavern's latrine facilities deserve special mention, mainly because they redefine the concept of indoor plumbing in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. Located in a small alcove behind the main room, the medieval toilet consists of a wooden seat positioned over what amounts to a hole leading to unknown depths. Privacy is provided by a curtain that's seen better decades, while sanitation follows the medieval principle of out of sight, out of mind. The smell alone could knock a modern person unconscious, but the tavern patrons navigate this area with the casual acceptance of people who've never known better alternatives. Medieval toilet paper, such as it existed, consisted of whatever soft materials were available: leaves, moss, cloth scraps, or, in better establishments, specially prepared wool or linen. The tavern's facilities include a basket of what appears to be hay and old fabric scraps, representing the height of medieval bathroom luxury. The disposal system relies on gravity and hope, with waste disappearing into a pit that's someone else's problem. Medieval people had developed elaborate etiquette around toilet use that prioritized speed and discretion while accepting that certain odors and sounds were simply part of communal living. Crazy Mary's approach to personal hygiene represents the extreme end of medieval cleanliness standards. Her clothes appear to have been designed by someone who'd heard about fabric but never actually seen any, and her hair has achieved a complexity of matting that approaches architectural significance. Yet she moves through the tavern with the confidence of someone who's transcended normal social expectations about appearance. Medieval society had learned to accommodate various levels of personal maintenance, creating informal hierarchies where cleanliness was negotiable but survival was not. Mary's hygiene philosophy seems to be based on the medieval belief that excessive cleanliness could interfere with spiritual development. Many religious mystics and holy hermits deliberately avoided washing as a form of penance and spiritual discipline, believing that bodily comfort distracted from heavenly concerns. Mary's appearance suggests she's either following this spiritual path or has simply given up on conventional hygiene entirely. Her presence in the tavern is tolerated partly because of superstitions about mistreating holy fools and partly because her prophetic abilities, however questionable, occasionally prove useful. The morning's hygiene revelations continue when the traveling entertainers attempt to freshen up after their performance. Melodious Martin produces a small Marora luxury item that most tavern patrons have never seen and attempts to improve his appearance using spit and determination. Medieval mirrors were polished metal surfaces that provided rough approximations of reflection rather than clear images, making personal grooming more art than science. Martin's efforts to tame his hair involve techniques that would mystify modern stylists, combining moisture, pressure, and prayer into a grooming routine that achieves questionable results. The entertainer's grooming kit represents the height of medieval personal care technology for traveling performers. Along with his metal mirror, Martin carries a small comb made from horn, a razor that's been sharpened so many times it's more suggestion than blade, and various pouches containing herbs and oils designed to improve his professional appearance. Medieval entertainers understood that their livelihood depended partly on maintaining an appearance that suggested success and competence, leading them to invest in personal grooming tools that most people couldn't afford or wouldn't know how to use. The blacksmith who entered earlier demonstrates the occupational hazards of medieval metalworking when he attempts to clean soot from his hands and arms. His profession involves constant exposure to coal dust, metal filings, and forge heat, creating a permanent patina that no amount of washing can completely remove. Medieval blacksmiths were recognizable from significant distances by their distinctive coloring and the smell of hot metal that followed them like a personal cloud. His attempts at cleanliness involve scraping rather than washing, using rough tools to remove the most obvious accumulations while accepting that some level of professional staining was simply part of the job. The blacksmith's hygiene routine includes specialized techniques for dealing with burns, cuts, and the various injuries that came with medieval metalworking. His approach to wound care involves applications of various salves and poultices that combine practical medicine with folk wisdom, creating treatments that sometimes worked despite being based on questionable theories. Medieval blacksmiths developed their own medical knowledge out of necessity, learning to treat the burns, cuts, and respiratory problems that came with working around fires and molten metal without access to modern medical care. The merchant's approach to hygiene reveals the class distinctions that governed medieval cleanliness standards. His clothes, while not exactly clean by modern standards, show evidence of regular maintenance and occasional washing. Medieval merchants understood that appearance affected business prospects, leading them to invest in personal maintenance as a professional necessity. His hands show the soft cleanliness of someone who handles money rather than livestock, while his face bears the careful grooming of someone who conducts business with people who have hygiene expectations. The merchant's hygiene investments include regular visits to bathhouses when available, professional laundry services for his better clothes, and access to imported soaps and perfumes that most people never encountered. His approach to personal maintenance represents the medieval middle class at its most aspirational, demonstrating that cleanliness was possible for those with sufficient resources and motivation. His presence in this particular tavern suggests either a temporary lapse in standards or a practical acceptance that sometimes business required venturing into less sanitary environments. A fascinating hygiene moment occurs when several patrons begin the medieval equivalent of freshening up, which involves the liberal application of herbs and spices to mask rather than eliminate offensive odors. Medieval people had developed an entire arsenal of aromatic plants designed to combat the smells of daily life, creating personal scent profiles that combined natural body odors with whatever herbs were available and affordable. The result was a complex olfactory landscape where individual scents blended into an overall tavern atmosphere that was uniquely medieval. The herbal approach to personal hygiene involved both internal and external applications, with medieval people consuming various plants believed to improve body odor while applying others directly to skin and clothing. The pilgrims demonstrate this technique by chewing fennel seeds and rubbing lavender on their robes, creating a fragrant cloud that temporarily masks their unwashed condition. Medieval herbalism included extensive knowledge about which plants could combat specific odors, leading to personalized scent combinations that were part practical hygiene and part folk magic. The gender differences in medieval hygiene become apparent as you observe the few women in the tavern managing their appearance with the limited resources available. Medieval women faced the additional challenge of maintaining femininity within a society that offered few tools for the purpose. Their approach to cleanliness involved creative solutions and improvised techniques that prioritized the most visible areas while accepting compromise in less obvious places. The serving wench's attempts to maintain a presentable appearance while working in tavern conditions represent a daily battle against inevitable defeat. Medieval women's hygiene included specialized knowledge about herbs and techniques for managing menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth in an era without modern sanitary products or medical understanding. The serving wench's personal maintenance routine includes applications of various plants believed to regulate feminine functions while masking the inevitable odors of medieval life. Women's hygiene practices were often passed down through generations of female knowledge that operated parallel to official medical theory, creating a hidden world of practical wisdom that rarely appeared in written records. Clothing maintenance in medieval times involved techniques that would amaze modern dry cleaners with their creativity and horrify them with their methodology. The pilgrims demonstrate the medieval approach to garment care by beating their robes with sticks to dislodge accumulated dirt and debris. This percussive cleaning method was supplemented by careful brushing, strategic mending, and the occasional application of fresh herbs to combat odors. Medieval people understood that clothes were expensive investments that needed to last for years, leading to maintenance routines that prioritized longevity over immediate cleanliness. The clothing care techniques visible in the tavern include methods for dealing with specific types of stains and odors that were common in medieval life. The merchant demonstrates the art of spot cleaning using a combination of saliva, friction, and determination, while the farmers employ techniques involving sand and rough stones to remove mud and manure from their work clothes. Medieval laundering, when it occurred, was a major undertaking that required heating large quantities of water, obtaining soap or substitute cleaning agents, and dedicating entire days to the washing and drying process. The tavern keeper's personal hygiene standards set the tone for the entire establishment, and his approach suggests that cleanliness is negotiable while intimidation is not. His apron, originally some color that's now lost to history, serves as both protective garment and advertisement for every meal he's served in the past month. Medieval tavern keepers walked a fine line between maintaining enough cleanliness to avoid poisoning their customers while not investing so much in hygiene that it affected their profit margins. His solution involves strategic cleaning of the most visible areas while accepting that certain level of grubbiness was simply part of the tavern atmosphere. As the morning progresses, you realize that medieval hygiene wasn't just about individual choice, it was about survival within a system that made cleanliness expensive, time-consuming, and potentially dangerous. The assembled tavern patrons have developed personal maintenance routines that balance health, social expectations, and practical limitations, creating a complex ecology of human cleanliness that functions within medieval constraints. And you're sitting in the middle of it all, increasingly aware that your modern hygiene standards mark you as clearly as your clean clothes, making you stand out in ways that could attract exactly the kind of attention you'd prefer to avoid in a world where being different often meant being dangerous. The afternoon entertainment begins when someone mentions that there's a bear chained behind the tavern, and suddenly the entire atmosphere shifts from casual drinking to anticipatory bloodlust. Medieval people, you quickly discover, had a very different relationship with what they considered fun than your Netflix-conditioned sensibilities can process. The bear in Questione Mangi, half-starved creature that's seen better decades since, dragged into the tavern's courtyard with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for visiting royalty. The crowd follows with the enthusiasm of people who genuinely believe that watching animals fight to the death counts as quality entertainment, which, in medieval terms, it absolutely did. Bear baiting, you learn from Old Henrik's enthusiastic commentary, represents the pinnacle of medieval sports entertainment. The concept is elegantly simple: chain a bear to a post, release dogs trained for combat, and place bets on whether the bear or the dogs will provide the most spectacular death. Henrik explains the finer points of bear baiting strategy with the detailed analysis of a modern sports commentator, discussing the relative merits of different dog breeds, the optimal chain length for maximum carnage, and the seasonal variations in bear aggression that serious gamblers needed to consider. The bear itself tells a story of medieval animal welfare that would horrify modern sensibilities while fascinating medieval spectators. This particular specimen has clearly participated in numerous baiting sessions, evidenced by the collection of scars, missing patches of fur, and the kind of world-weary expression that suggests its developed philosophical acceptance of its role in medieval entertainment. The crowd examines the bear with the critical eye of people evaluating an investment, discussing its probable performance while placing bets that represent significant portions of their annual income. Now this here's a proper bear, Henrik declares with the authority of someone who's witnessed countless animal combats. Look at them claws still got fight in him. And see how it moves? That's a bear what knows the game. His analysis continues with observations about bear psychology, combat tactics, and the various factors that could influence the outcome of the upcoming spectacle. Medieval bear baiting wasn't just mindless violence, it was a complex sport with elaborate rules, strategies, and betting systems that made modern gambling look simple by comparison. The dogs arrive next, and you realize you're about to witness medieval selective breeding at its most practical and terrifying. These aren't the pampered pets of modern dog shows theory, purpose-built killing machines bred for aggression, pain tolerance, and the specific skill set required to attack bears while avoiding immediate death. The lead dog, a massive mastiff whose scars suggest extensive combat experience, surveys the bear with the calculating gaze of a professional evaluator. The other dogs, a mix of breeds chosen for complementary combat skills, follow their leader's assessment while the crowd evaluates their betting options. Historians still argue whether medieval bear baiting represented genuine entertainment or served deeper social functions related to community bonding, social hierarchy, and collective stress relief. The evidence suggests all of the above bear baiting events brought communities together while providing acceptable outlets for violent impulses in a society where violence was a constant threat. The elaborate betting systems also created opportunities for wealth redistribution and social mobility, allowing clever gamblers to improve their economic status through superior knowledge of animal combat dynamics. William the Miller emerges as the afternoon's primary betting coordinator, his mysterious morning wealth making him the natural choice for managing the complex wagering that accompanies any proper bear baiting session. Medieval gambling operated on systems that would confuse modern bookmakers with their complexity, incorporating odds that factored in everything from weather conditions to the religious affiliations of the spectators. William's approach to odds-making involves consultations with various local experts, including farmers who claim knowledge about animal behavior and pilgrims who insist their prayers can influence combat outcomes. The entertainment value of bear baiting extended beyond the actual combat to include the elaborate pre-fight rituals that built anticipation while extracting maximum revenue from spectators. The bear is formally introduced to the crowd with the kind of biographical details usually reserved for human celebrities, including its previous victories, notable defeats, and any special characteristics that might influence betting decisions. The dogs receive similar treatment, with their handlers providing combat histories that read like medieval military records. Brother Marcus, apparently abandoning his religious persona for the afternoon, emerges as an enthusiastic gambling participant while maintaining the pretense of spiritual oversight. His approach to bear baiting involves blessing both animals while placing strategic bets that suggest his divine inspiration extends to profitable gambling strategies. Medieval religious authorities had complex relationships with animal combat sports, officially disapproving while practically participating in community events that everyone attended regardless of theoretical moral objections. The actual combat preparations reveal the sophisticated logistics required for medieval entertainment that involved potentially lethal wild animals in confined spaces filled with drunken spectators. The bear is secured with chains that allow sufficient movement for interesting combat while preventing escape that could transform entertainment into general catastrophe. The courtyard is arranged to provide optimal viewing for paying customers while maintaining escape routes for when the entertainment inevitably spirals beyond anyone's control. Crazy Mary provides prophetic commentary on the upcoming combat, offering predictions that combine animal behavior observation with mystical insights that may or may not prove accurate. Her prophecies include detailed forecasts about which dog will draw first blood, whether the bear will survive the encounter, and various supernatural influences that might affect the outcome. Medieval people took such predictions seriously, incorporating prophetic insights into their betting strategies while maintaining healthy skepticism about prophecies that consistently proved wrong. The crowd's reaction to the pre-combat preparations reveals the social dynamics that governed medieval entertainment consumption. The merchant secures the premium viewing position through a combination of bribery and implied threat, while the obvious peasants cluster in areas where flying blood is more likely but admission costs less. The pilgrims negotiate religious exemptions that allow them to observe without officially participating, creating theological loopholes that satisfy their spiritual obligations while enabling their entertainment consumption. A knife-throwing competition breaks out spontaneously when one of the traveling entertainers suggests that waiting for bear baiting provides an excellent opportunity for additional gambling opportunities. Medieval knife games operated on the principle that any activity became more interesting when participants risked serious injury for the entertainment of paying audiences. The target for this particular competition is a wooden board marked with increasingly valuable scoring zones, though the real entertainment comes from watching contestants attempt accuracy while drunk on morning ale. The knife-throwing participants include several tavern patrons whose qualifications seem limited to owning sharp objects and displaying more confidence than skill. The blacksmith participates with professional-grade blades that suggest serious metalworking capabilities, while the farmers contribute agricultural implements that were never designed for throwing but achieve impressive results through enthusiastic application. The entertainer himself demonstrates techniques that combine genuine skill with theatrical flair, creating a performance that's part sport and part professional demonstration. Medieval knife games included elaborate safety protocols designed to minimize spectator casualties while maximizing entertainment value. The throwing area is carefully marked to prevent audience members from wandering into the line of fire, though enforcement relies more on common sense than formal barriers. Participants follow unwritten rules about acceptable targets, appropriate weapons, and the etiquette of competitive blade throwing that everyone understands but nobody officially teaches. The storytelling competition that develops alongside the knife throwing represents medieval entertainment at its most participatory and potentially dangerous. Contestants must tell increasingly outrageous tales while continuing to throw knives at targets, creating a performance challenge that tests both narrative creativity and manual dexterity simultaneously. The stories themselves range from obviously fictional adventures to personal experiences that may or may not have actually happened, all delivered with the kind of dramatic flair that medieval audiences expected from proper entertainment. Old Henrik dominates the storytelling competition with tales that incorporate elements from every conflict he's ever witnessed, heard about, or completely imagined. His stories feature armies of implausible size engaged in battles of impossible scope, all delivered with the kind of specific detail that suggests either phenomenal memory or extraordinary creative ability. The audience listens with the appreciation of people who understand that entertainment value matters more than historical accuracy, especially when the entertainment involves weapons and alcohol. The tavern keeper uses the afternoon's entertainment as an opportunity to demonstrate his own skills with a crossbow that's clearly seen extensive use in situations that probably weren't recreational. Medieval tavern keepers often maintained weapon proficiency as a professional necessity, dealing with customers who might resort to violence when disputes about payment or service arose. His crossbow technique suggests someone who's used the weapon for purposes that extended beyond entertainment, though he presents his skills as merely another form of tavern amusement. A dice game emerges among the pilgrims, who apparently interpret their religious journey as including extensive gambling opportunities that test their faith through financial risk. Medieval dice games operated on probability systems that would fascinate modern mathematicians while bankrupting anyone who tried to calculate actual odds. The pilgrim's approach to gambling involves elaborate rituals designed to invoke divine intervention while employing strategies that suggest extensive experience with games of chance. The afternoon's entertainment reveals the complex relationship between medieval people and activities that modern society would consider unacceptably dangerous. Every game involves potential injury, every bet represents significant financial risk, and every participant understands that entertainment and survival exist in delicate balance. The assembled crowd approaches these activities with the casual acceptance of people who live in a world where danger is constant and entertainment opportunities are rare enough to justify considerable risk. As the bear-baiting preparations continue and the various subsidiary entertainments reach their crescendos, you realize that medieval people didn't just have different entertainment standards, they had fundamentally different relationships with violence, risk, and the value of human and animal life. The afternoon's activities represent community bonding through shared bloodlust, economic opportunity through strategic gambling, and social hierarchy enforcement through controlled violence. And you're sitting in the middle of it all, increasingly aware that declining to participate in activities that everyone else considers essential community engagement could mark you as suspicious, dangerous, or simply too foreign to trust. The afternoon's festivities take a decidedly grim turn when one of the farmers, the same one who was arguing about soil preparation earlier, suddenly collapses near the bear-baiting ring, clutching his stomach and making sounds that would terrify a modern emergency room. Medieval medicine, you're about to discover, operates on principles that make medieval hygiene look advanced by comparison. The crowd gathers around the writhing man with the kind of morbid fascination that people reserve for watching car accidents. Except in this case, the accident is happening to someone's internal organs, and the emergency response team consists of whoever happens to be drunk enough to offer medical advice. "He's got the sweating sickness," declares Crazy Mary with the confident diagnosis of someone whose medical training consists entirely of watching people die from various mysterious ailments. Her pronouncement sends a ripple of concern through the assembled crowd, not because anyone particularly cares about the farmer's welfare, but because sweating sickness has a tendency to spread through communities with the efficiency of medieval gossip. Medieval people understood that mysterious illnesses could transform thriving villages into ghost towns within weeks, making any unusual symptoms a matter of community survival rather than individual concern. The farmer's symptoms provide a textbook example of medieval medical complexity, combining physical manifestations that could indicate anything from food poisoning to divine punishment. His face has achieved a greenish pallor that suggests either serious illness or advanced ale consumption, while his groaning follows patterns that medieval medical theory would analyze for diagnostic significance. His body temperature appears to be fluctuating wildly, creating the hot and cold cycles that medieval physicians interpreted as evidence of humoral imbalance requiring immediate intervention through whatever treatments happen to be available. The tavern keeper immediately shifts into crisis management mode, which involves less actual medical intervention and more damage control designed to prevent mass panic from disrupting his business operations. His approach to medical emergencies prioritizes maintaining order and minimizing financial losses, while accepting that customer mortality is simply part of the tavern experience. He produces a leather bottle containing what he claims is medicinal spirits, though the smell suggests it's more likely paint thinner with aspirational healing properties. Medieval tavern keepers maintain stockpiles of supposed medical supplies partly for genuine emergencies and partly for the marketing value of appearing prepared for customer health crises. The medicinal alcohol represents medieval medicine's most reliable treatment option, serving simultaneously as anesthetic, antiseptic, and general cure-all for conditions that defied more specific intervention. The tavern keeper's medicinal spirits have clearly been aged in conditions that prioritized alcohol content over palatability, creating a beverage that could either cure the farmer or preserve his body for later examination. Medieval people understood that strong drink could provide pain relief and prevent wound infection, even when they didn't understand the mechanisms that made alcohol medically useful. Old Henrik, drawing on his extensive experience with battlefield medicine, offers to bleed the patient using a rusty knife that's clearly seen service in multiple non-medical applications. Medieval medical theory held that most illnesses resulted from imbalances in the body's four humors, making bloodletting the go-to treatment for everything from headaches to plague. Henrik's technique involves making strategic cuts designed to release the corrupted humors while hopefully avoiding major arteries, though his success rate appears to be more about luck than skill. "In my day," Henrik announces while sharpening his knife on his boot, "we knew how to treat a man properly. None of this newfangled nonsense about keeping blood inside the body where it belongs." His medical philosophy represents medieval healthcare at its most confident and least effective, combining ancient theories with battlefield experience to create treatments that might cure patients or might accelerate their journey to the afterlife. The farmer's groaning intensifies as Henrik approaches with his improvised surgical instrument, though whether from fear or worsening symptoms remains unclear. The bloodletting preparation reveals the elaborate theoretical framework that governed medieval medical practice. Henrik's approach involves careful consideration of which veins to open based on the patient's symptoms, the current astrological conditions, and his personal experience with similar cases. Medieval bloodletting wasn't random violence, it was a sophisticated medical practice based on complex theories about human physiology that happened to be completely wrong. The technique required knowledge of anatomy, understanding of blood flow patterns, and the ability to make precise cuts that would release the appropriate amount of blood without causing immediate death. Brother Marcus attempts to provide spiritual intervention through prayer and the application of holy relics that may or may not actually be holy, depending on where he acquired them and what he paid. Medieval medicine recognized the importance of spiritual healing alongside physical treatment, creating integrated approaches that addressed both bodily and divine causes of illness. Marcus's collection of religious artifacts includes what he claims is a fragment of a saint's bone, a vial of holy water from Canterbury, and a prayer scroll that's supposed to cure everything from consumption to demonic possession. The holy relics themselves tell the story of medieval medical commerce, where spiritual healing tools were bought, sold, and traded like any other medical supplies. Marcus's saint's bone fragment could be genuine, could be from any random skeleton, or could be carved would treated to look ancient. The medieval relic market was notorious for creative interpretations of authenticity. His holy water shows the telltale signs of frequent refilling from less sacred sources, while his prayer scroll bears the kind of wear that suggests either extensive use or careful aging to improve its apparent antiquity. The medical debate that erupts around the collapsed farmer reveals the competing theories that governed medieval healthcare decisions. Some patrons advocate for immediate bloodletting to release the evil humors, while others insist that the problem requires dietary intervention involving specific combinations of foods designed to restore bodily balance. A third faction argues for supernatural intervention through prayer, exorcism, or the application of various charms and amulets that protect against magical ailments. Medieval medical practice involved negotiating between these competing approaches, often combining multiple treatments in hopes that one would prove effective. The dietary intervention advocates produced detailed theories about which foods could restore the farmer's humoral balance based on their understanding of how different substances affected bodily functions. Medieval nutrition operated on principles that classified foods according to their heating or cooling properties, their moisture content, and their spiritual implications. The merchant suggests foods that would increase the farmer's hot, dry humors to counteract his obviously cold, wet condition, while the pilgrims advocate for foods that align with proper spiritual practice and avoid substances that might interfere with divine healing. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was genuinely ineffective or simply different in its approach to healing, But watching Henrik prepare to bleed a man using a knife that's been used to clean fish suggests that effectiveness wasn't the primary consideration. Medieval medical practitioners operated within theoretical frameworks that made perfect sense given their understanding of human anatomy and disease causation, even when those frameworks bore no relationship to actual medical reality. The result was healthcare that was confidently administered and frequently fatal, though occasionally successful enough to maintain faith in the system. The serving wench contributes her own medical expertise, which involves the preparation of herbal remedies using ingredients that she identifies through methods that seem to involve more guesswork than botanical knowledge. Medieval women often served as primary healthcare providers within their communities, developing extensive knowledge of plant-based medicines through generations of practical experience. Her approach to herbal healing involves creating potions that combine traditional ingredients with whatever happens to be available in the tavern's kitchen, creating medicines that might help or might add food poisoning to the patient's existing problems. The herbal pharmacy that emerges from the tavern's kitchen reveals the extensive botanical knowledge that medieval people maintained despite lacking formal medical training. The serving wench's collection includes willow bark for pain relief, chamomile for digestive problems, garlic for general health promotion, and various aromatic herbs whose specific functions have been lost to time but whose inclusion in medical preparations was considered essential. Medieval herbal medicine represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about plant properties, though the accuracy of this wisdom was often questionable and the preparation methods were frequently improvised. The herbal remedy preparation becomes a community activity as various patrons contribute ingredients and advice based on their personal experiences with similar ailments. The resulting concoction includes willow bark for pain relief, various aromatic herbs for general health promotion, and several substances that nobody can properly identify but everyone insists are essential for proper treatment. Medieval medical preparations followed recipes that had been passed down through generations, though the accuracy of transmission was often questionable and the original effectiveness was frequently uncertain. The community medicine chest that develops around the farmer's treatment reveals the collective medical knowledge of medieval tavern patrons, combining folk wisdom, religious beliefs, and personal experience into a therapeutic approach that's both comprehensive and completely unregulated. Each contributor offers ingredients based on their understanding of what works for particular conditions, creating a medicine that incorporates elements from multiple medical traditions without any central authority to coordinate or evaluate the various components. William the Miller offers his own medical intervention in the form of prayers to Saint Blaise, the patron saint of various ailments, though his theological knowledge appears to be as questionable as his recent financial windfall. Medieval people maintained extensive relationships with specialized saints who were believed to intercede in specific medical conditions, creating a healthcare system that combined physical treatment with targeted spiritual intervention. William's approach to saintly intervention involves elaborate bargaining that promises various offerings in exchange for miraculous healing, though his negotiation style suggests more commercial than religious experience. The saint-based healing system reveals the complex spiritual marketplace that governed medieval medical practice, where different saints specialized in particular ailments and could be petitioned through appropriate offerings and prayers. William's knowledge of saint specializations appears to be based more on tavern gossip than theological study, but his confidence in negotiating with divine powers reflects the medieval understanding that health was ultimately controlled by supernatural forces that could be influenced through proper spiritual techniques. The patient himself provides a running commentary on his symptoms that reads like a medieval medical textbook written by someone experiencing the conditions firsthand. His descriptions include detailed accounts of internal sensations that medieval people believed provided crucial diagnostic information, combined with personal theories about what might have caused his current distress. Medieval patients were expected to participate actively in their own medical evaluation, providing physicians with subjective information that modern doctors would find both fascinating and medically useless. The farmer's symptom descriptions follow medieval medical vocabulary that classified internal sensations according to their relationship to the four humors and their spiritual implications. His reports of hot and cold sensations, feelings of internal movement, and various pain patterns provide diagnostic information that the assembled crowd analyzes according to their understanding of how different ailments manifest in human consciousness. Medieval medicine relied heavily on patient self-reporting because external diagnostic tools were limited to observation and touch. The crowd's medical opinions reveal the democratic nature of medieval healthcare, where everyone's theories carried equal weight regardless of their actual medical knowledge or experience. The blacksmith advocates for treatments involving heat application. The merchant suggests remedies based on his travel experiences with foreign medical practices. And the pilgrims offer spiritual solutions that incorporate elements from various religious traditions they've encountered during their journeys. Medieval medical care was truly a community effort, though the results were often more representative of collective ignorance than collective wisdom. The treatment debate that develops around the farmer reveals the philosophical differences that govern medieval approaches to illness and healing. Some participants advocate for aggressive intervention designed to force the body back into proper balance, while others suggest gentle treatments that work with natural healing processes. A third group insists that the farmer's condition represents divine punishment that requires spiritual rather than physical solutions, creating a medical consultation that incorporates elements of theology, natural philosophy, and practical experience. A heated debate develops about whether the farmer's condition represents natural illness or supernatural intervention, a distinction that carried significant implications for treatment approaches. Medieval people understood that some ailments required physical intervention while others demanded spiritual solutions, making accurate diagnosis a matter of choosing the right theoretical framework rather than identifying specific pathogens or physiological problems. The discussion involves careful evaluation of the patient's recent behavior, spiritual status, and potential exposure to various supernatural influences that might manifest as physical symptoms. The supernatural medicine faction produces various protective charms and amulets designed to ward off evil influences while promoting natural healing processes. Medieval magical medicine operated alongside conventional treatments, providing additional therapeutic options that addressed spiritual causes of physical ailments. The charms themselves include written prayers, blessed objects, and various natural materials that were believed to possess protective or healing properties when properly prepared and applied. The magical medicine preparations reveal the elaborate ritual systems that governed supernatural healing practices in medieval society. Each charm requires specific preparation methods, particular words of blessing, and precise application techniques that ensure proper spiritual function. The practitioners demonstrate knowledge of magical theory that's as complex as any medical system, involving understanding of sympathetic magic, divine intervention, and the spiritual properties of various materials and symbols. Crazy Mary emerges as the voice of diagnostic authority, offering detailed explanations of the farmer's condition that incorporate elements of medical theory, supernatural speculation, and personal revelation that may or may not be divinely inspired. Her medical opinions carry unexpected weight with the assembled crowd, partly because of her reputation for occasional accuracy and partly because medieval people understood that madness sometimes provided insights that sanity couldn't achieve. Her treatment recommendations involve elaborate rituals that combine practical remedies with mystical interventions. Mary's diagnostic method involves reading signs and portents that she claims reveal the spiritual causes of physical ailments, creating medical evaluations that incorporate everything from the patient's recent dreams to the behavior of local wildlife. Her approach to medical divination represents medieval healing at its most mystical, combining observation of physical symptoms with interpretation of supernatural signs that supposedly reveal the deeper causes of illness. The medical emergency reveals the economic implications of illness in medieval society, where individual health problems quickly became community concerns due to shared labor dependencies and collective survival requirements. The farmer's condition affects not only his personal welfare, but also the agricultural productivity that everyone depends on for survival, making his recovery a matter of community investment rather than individual concern. The discussion of treatment costs reveals the complex calculations that governed medieval healthcare decisions, where expensive treatments had to be weighed against probable outcomes and community resources. As the afternoon progresses and various treatments are applied with varying degrees of confidence and competence, you realize that medieval medicine represents humanity's earnest attempt to deal with disease and injury using the best available knowledge, even when that knowledge was fundamentally flawed. The assembled crowd approaches medical intervention with the same combination of hope, desperation, and practical acceptance that characterizes all medieval survival strategies. And you're watching it all unfold, increasingly aware that medieval people didn't just live with different medical standards. They lived in a world where illness was a community event and everyone was expected to contribute to treatment decisions, regardless of their actual medical knowledge or the probable effectiveness of their suggestions. The farmer's medical crisis takes an unexpected turn when someone accuses the blacksmith of poisoning the ale, and suddenly what started as a health emergency transforms into a full-blown legal investigation with all the fairness and rationality you'd expect from medieval justice. The accusation spreads through the crowd with the speed of wildfire, and within moments, the tavern has divided into factions supporting various theories about who poisoned whom, why they did it, and what should be done about it. Medieval law enforcement, you're about to discover, operates on principles that make medieval medicine look scientifically rigorous. The initial accusation comes from Deep Thoughts Robert, whose philosophical insights apparently extend to criminal detection despite his continued consumption of the allegedly poisoned ale. His logic, such as it exists, suggests that the blacksmith's recent arrival coincided suspiciously with the farmer's illness, making him the obvious culprit in a crime that may or may not have actually occurred. Medieval people understood that coincidence and causation were essentially the same thing when it came to assigning blame for unfortunate events, especially when the alternative was accepting that bad things sometimes happened for no identifiable reason. "I seen him near the ale barrel," Robert declares with the confidence of someone whose investigative methodology consists entirely of remembering things that might have happened while he was drunk. His testimony immediately gains credibility with the crowd, not because of its accuracy but because medieval legal proceedings prioritized confident assertion over verifiable evidence. The blacksmith's protests of innocence only served to make him look more suspicious, following the medieval legal principle that innocent people don't need to defend themselves so vigorously. The tavern keeper finds himself in the uncomfortable position of serving as both judge and potential conspirator, since his establishment provided the venue for the alleged crime and his ale supplied the murder weapon. Medieval tavern keepers often functioned as informal legal authorities within their establishments, settling disputes and dispensing justice according to principles that balanced community harmony with business interests. His approach to the current crisis involves careful evaluation of which verdict would be least disruptive to his ongoing operations while satisfying the crowd's demand for dramatic resolution. The blacksmith's defense strategy involves producing witnesses who can vouch for his character, though the quality of these witnesses raises questions about medieval standards for credible testimony. Old Henrik offers to swear that the blacksmith is a good Christian man who's never poisoned nobody that didn't deserve it, which somehow fails to improve the defendant's position. The merchant provides testimony about the blacksmith's professional reputation, though his evidence focuses more on metalworking skills than poisoning tendencies, creating character references that miss the central legal issues. Medieval legal procedures emphasized community participation over professional expertise, making every tavern patron a potential judge, jury, and executioner depending on the day's circumstances. The assembled crowd approaches the blacksmith's case with the kind of democratic enthusiasm that ensures everyone's opinion carries equal weight regardless of their knowledge of law, evidence, or basic logic. The result is a legal proceeding that combines elements of community theater, religious ritual, and mob justice into a system that prioritized entertainment value over accurate verdict determination. brother Marcus attempts to provide spiritual oversight for the legal proceedings, offering to hear confessions and provide religious guidance that might resolve the crisis through divine intervention rather than human judgment. Medieval law recognized the authority of religious figures to mediate disputes and provide moral guidance that supplemented secular legal procedures. Marcus's approach involves extensive questioning about the spiritual state of everyone involved, creating a parallel investigation that focuses on sin and redemption rather than evidence and proof. The confession process reveals the complex relationship between medieval law and religious authority, where spiritual crimes often carried more serious consequences than physical offenses. Marcus's interrogation techniques involve detailed questions about recent thoughts, dreams, and spiritual practices that might indicate criminal tendencies or divine displeasure. His theological investigation operates alongside the secular legal proceeding, creating dual systems of justice that sometimes conflicted but usually reinforced each other's conclusions. William the Miller emerges as an unexpected legal authority, offering to serve as judge based on his experience with grain disputes and his recent mysterious prosperity that suggests divine favor or criminal success. Medieval legal appointments often depended more on availability and community status than formal legal training, making successful merchants natural choices for judicial roles. William's approach to justice involves extensive consultation with various legal precedents that he claims to remember from previous cases, though his memory appears to be as unreliable as his recent financial explanations. The legal precedents that William cites reveal the informal nature of medieval jurisprudence, where previous cases were remembered through oral tradition rather than written records. His examples include disputes about stolen livestock, arguments over grain quality, and various cases of alleged witchcraft that were resolved through methods that modern legal scholars would find both fascinating and terrifying. Medieval legal precedent operated more like folklore than case law, creating a system where justice depended on community memory and collective interpretation of traditional practices. The evidence-gathering process begins when several patrons volunteer to search the blacksmith's belongings for proof of his poisoning activities. Medieval legal investigations relied heavily on physical evidence, though the interpretation of such evidence followed principles that would confuse modern forensic scientists. The blacksmith's tool collection becomes the focus of intensive examination, with various implements being evaluated for their potential use in criminal activities that may or may not have actually occurred. Historians still argue whether medieval legal procedures were genuinely designed to determine truth or simply provided socially acceptable methods for resolving community conflicts through ritualized violence. The evidence suggests both functions operated simultaneously. Legal proceedings offered structured approaches to dispute resolution while allowing communities to express collective judgment about social behavior. The blacksmith's case demonstrates how medieval justice balanced individual rights against community stability, though the balance usually favored whatever outcome satisfied the largest number of armed spectators. The testimony phase reveals the democratic chaos that characterized medieval legal proceedings, where every witness could provide evidence regardless of their knowledge of the case or their credibility as observers. Crazy Mary offers prophetic insights about the blacksmith's guilt based on her interpretation of various supernatural signs, while the serving wench provides detailed accounts of everyone's drinking patterns that may or may not be relevant to the poisoning allegations. Medieval legal proceedings welcomed all testimony on the theory that truth would emerge from the collective wisdom of community participation. The witness testimony includes increasingly elaborate theories about the blacksmith's criminal methodology, with various patrons explaining how they would have committed the crime if they had been inclined to poison ale barrels. These hypothetical confessions somehow become evidence against the actual defendant, following medieval legal logic that suggested criminal knowledge indicated criminal intention. The blacksmith's growing frustration with the proceedings only reinforces the crowd's conviction that he's guilty of something, even if the specific charges remain somewhat unclear. A crucial development occurs when someone discovers a small pouch of herbs in the blacksmith's belongings, immediately interpreting this as evidence of his poisoning activities. Medieval people maintained extensive collections of medicinal and culinary herbs for legitimate purposes, but in legal contexts, any unusual substances could be reinterpreted as criminal tools. The herb collection becomes the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, with various patrons offering expert testimony about the poisonous properties of plants they probably can't even identify correctly. The herbal evidence analysis reveals the thin line between medieval medicine and medieval murder, where many healing substances could also cause harm when used inappropriately. The crowd's botanical expertise proves to be as questionable as their legal knowledge, but their confidence in identifying dangerous plants remains unshaken by their obvious ignorance. Medieval legal proceedings often turned on this kind of amateur expert testimony, where community members provided specialized knowledge that was accepted without verification or challenge. The trial by ordeal option emerges when William suggests that divine intervention might resolve the case more efficiently than human investigation. Medieval legal systems included various methods for invoking supernatural judgment when human evidence proved insufficient or contradictory. The proposed ordeals include having the blacksmith handle hot iron to prove his innocence, requiring him to retrieve stones from boiling water, or subjecting him to trial by combat against whoever wanted to challenge his claims of innocence. The trial by ordeal preparations reveal the elaborate theological framework that governed medieval approaches to divine justice. Each ordeal required specific religious preparations, particular prayers, and careful attention to proper ritual procedures that would ensure accurate supernatural judgment. The crowd's enthusiasm for trial by ordeal reflects medieval confidence that God would intervene directly in human legal proceedings to ensure just outcomes, though the practical results often had more to do with pain tolerance than divine favor. The combat trial option gains unexpected support when the farmer still suffering from his mysterious ailment offers to fight the blacksmith as soon as he recovers enough to stand upright. Medieval trial by combat operated on the principle that God would ensure victory for the innocent party, making physical confrontation a legitimate method for resolving legal disputes. The proposed combat between a possibly poisoned farmer and an allegedly criminal blacksmith represents medieval justice at its most practical and least sensible. The legal proceedings reach a crescendo when the tavern keeper announces that he's discovered additional evidence in the form of witness testimony from his chickens, whose recent egg-laying patterns apparently reveal important information about criminal activities in the vicinity. Medieval legal systems occasionally included testimony from animals, though usually through human interpreters who claimed to understand animal behavior patterns. The chicken evidence somehow strengthens the case against the blacksmith, following legal logic that prioritizes creative interpretation over rational analysis. As the afternoon's legal drama unfolds with all the efficiency and fairness of a medieval witch trial, you realize that medieval justice wasn't designed to determine truth so much as to provide community entertainment while maintaining social order through ritualized conflict resolution. The blacksmith's fate depends less on evidence than on the crowd's collective mood and their need for dramatic resolution to the day's events. And you're watching it all happen, increasingly aware that medieval legal proceedings could transform any innocent bystander into either a witness, a judge, or a defendant, depending on the community's need for participation and their assessment of your entertainment value. The blacksmith's legal troubles reach their resolution when William the Miller offers to pay the man's alleged debts in exchange for dropping the poisoning charges. And suddenly everyone discovers that medieval economics operates on principles that would make modern accountants weep with frustration. The entire afternoon's drama transforms from criminal justice to financial negotiation, revealing a monetary system so complex and arbitrary that determining the actual value of anything requires consultation with experts who may or may not know what they're talking about. You're about to learn that medieval people didn't just have different currency, they had fundamentally different concepts of what money actually represented. The first challenge involves determining what currency William is offering and whether anyone knows how to convert it into denominations that the blacksmith can actually use. Medieval money existed in a bewildering variety of coins, tokens, and promissory notes issued by different authorities who may or may not still exist and whose silver content varied according to principles that seemed to change with political winds. William produces a handful of coins that include silver pennies from 3 different kingdoms, copper tokens from a monastery that burned down last winter, and what appears to be a gold piece that everyone agrees is either extremely valuable or completely worthless, depending on whose authority issued it. These here are good Flemish silver, William announces, holding up coins that look suspiciously different from each other despite their allegedly common origin. Medieval people had developed impressive expertise in evaluating currency authenticity, since counterfeit coins were as common as genuine ones and twice as profitable for their creators. The assembled crowd examines William's money with the practiced eye of people who understand that accepting the wrong currency could mean financial disaster, while rejecting the right currency could mean missing the only payment opportunity they'd see this year. The merchant emerges as the tavern's unofficial currency expert, offering to evaluate William's coins using techniques that combine scientific analysis with educated guesswork. Medieval money changers developed sophisticated methods for testing silver content, weight accuracy, and mint authenticity, though their equipment consisted mainly of small scales, testing needles, and accumulated experience that may or may not prove reliable. His evaluation process involves biting coins, weighing them against known standards, and consulting with other patrons whose monetary expertise varies dramatically in both scope and accuracy. The currency evaluation reveals the fundamental instability of medieval monetary systems, where the value of coins fluctuated based on political conditions, silver availability, and the current reputation of whoever issued them. The merchant's analysis suggests that some of William's coins are definitely valuable, others are probably worthless, and several fall into categories that require further investigation by authorities who aren't present and might not exist. Medieval commerce operated within this uncertainty, creating business relationships that prioritize trust over precise monetary calculations. The blacksmith's response to the payment offer reveals his own understanding of medieval economic realities, where accepting questionable currency might be better than facing legal proceedings that could result in losing everything he owns plus various body parts. His evaluation of William's offer involves complex calculations that factor in the probable value of the coins, the likelihood that the legal case would end badly for him, and the general principle that any money was better than no money when facing medieval justice. Medieval people developed sophisticated risk assessment skills out of necessity, learning to evaluate multiple forms of potential disaster simultaneously. Brother Marcus offers to provide spiritual guidance about the financial transaction, suggesting prayers that might improve the currency's value through divine intervention. Medieval economics included extensive supernatural elements, where religious blessings could theoretically enhance monetary value while curses could destroy financial prosperity overnight. His approach to financial blessing involves elaborate rituals designed to invoke divine favor for commercial transactions, though his effectiveness appears to depend more on the participants' faith than any measurable improvement in coin quality. The religious blessing process reveals the complex relationship between medieval spirituality and commerce, where business success was understood to depend partly on divine favor and partly on human effort. Marcus's blessing rituals include prayers for honest dealing, protection against counterfeit currency, and general prosperity that benefits everyone involved in the transaction. Medieval people understood that economic activity carried moral implications that required spiritual oversight, creating business practices that incorporated religious considerations alongside practical concerns. The tavern keeper's involvement in the financial negotiations reveals his own economic interests in resolving the conflict quickly and profitably. Medieval tavern keepers functioned as informal banks, money changers, and credit agencies within their communities, providing financial services that formal institutions couldn't or wouldn't offer. His approach to the current transaction involves evaluating how the payment arrangement affects his own financial interests while ensuring that the resolution doesn't create additional problems that could disrupt his business operations. A secondary economic crisis emerges when several patrons realize that the financial negotiations have reminded them of their own unpaid debts, creating a domino effect of monetary obligations that threatens to bankrupt everyone in the tavern simultaneously. Medieval debt relationships formed complex networks that connected entire communities through chains of mutual obligation, making individual financial problems potential disasters for everyone involved. The simple resolution of the blacksmith's legal troubles triggers a comprehensive review of who owes what to whom, revealing economic relationships that nobody had bothered to track systematically. The debt crisis reveals the informal nature of medieval financial record-keeping, where most obligations existed only in human memory and community awareness rather than written contracts. Old Henrik owes money to the merchant for services that may or may not have been rendered, while the pilgrims owe various tavern debts that they claim their religious mission exempts them from paying. The serving wench emerges as an unexpected creditor with detailed knowledge of everyone's drinking tabs, creating financial obligations that the patrons had apparently hoped she'd forgotten. Historians still argue whether medieval economic systems were genuinely chaotic or simply operated according to principles that modern people find difficult to understand. But watching a tavern full of people argue about debt obligations that nobody recorded suggests that chaos was at least partially accurate. Medieval commerce required tremendous trust and community memory to function, creating economic relationships that were intensely personal and potentially explosive when disagreements arose. The currency conversion process becomes increasingly complex as more people contribute their expertise to determining exchange rates between various coins and tokens. Medieval money changing involved calculations that factored in silver content, political stability, transportation costs, and risk assessments that would challenge modern financial analysts. The crowd's collective approach to currency evaluation produces results that vary dramatically depending on who's doing the calculating and what assumptions they're making about economic conditions in places they've never visited. The exchange rate negotiations reveal the localized nature of medieval economics, where money that was valuable in one region might be worthless 20 miles away, depending on political relationships and trade connections. William's Flemish silver carries different values depending on whether the evaluator trusts Flemish political stability, believes in the authenticity of the coins, or understands current exchange relationships between various regional currencies. Medieval merchants developed extensive knowledge of these variables out of necessity, but their expertise was constantly challenged by changing political and economic conditions. Crazy Mary provides her own economic insights, offering prophecies about future currency values based on her interpretation of various supernatural signs. Medieval economics included extensive speculation about future conditions, where prophetic insights could influence current financial decisions even when the prophecies had no basis in reality. Mary's predictions about silver prices, political stability, and divine intervention in monetary matters carry unexpected weight with some patrons, revealing the mystical elements that influenced medieval financial planning. The prophetic financial advice reveals the uncertainty that governed medieval economic planning, where future conditions were so unpredictable that supernatural guidance seemed as reliable as rational analysis. Mary's economic prophecies include detailed predictions about which currencies would maintain their value, what political changes might affect trade relationships, and how divine intervention might influence commercial success. Medieval people incorporated these mystical elements into their financial planning because practical analysis alone couldn't account for the variables that determined economic survival. A breakthrough occurs when the merchant proposes a complex barter arrangement that bypasses currency problems by exchanging goods and services instead of money. Medieval economics relied heavily on barter systems that operated alongside monetary exchange, creating trade relationships that were based on immediate value rather than abstract currency calculations. The proposed arrangement involves trading the blacksmith's metalworking services for agricultural products, tavern credits, and various other considerations that avoid the complications of monetary evaluation. The barter negotiations reveal the practical flexibility of medieval economic systems, where value could be determined through direct exchange rather than currency conversion. The blacksmith skills have clear value to community members who need tools repaired or weapons maintained, while the farmer's agricultural products provide immediate benefits that don't require currency evaluation. Medieval barter systems allowed communities to function economically even when monetary systems were unreliable or unavailable. The final economic resolution involves a complex arrangement that satisfies everyone's financial needs while avoiding most of the currency problems that started the negotiations. William's payment combines legitimate coins, barter commitments, and promissory notes that will be settled through future arrangements involving multiple parties and various forms of value exchange. Medieval economic solutions often required creative approaches that balanced immediate needs against future obligations, creating financial relationships that were intensely personal and community-based. As the afternoon's economic drama reaches its conclusion with everyone apparently satisfied despite nobody clearly understanding what they've agreed to, you realize that medieval economics wasn't just about different money, it was about fundamentally different concepts of value, exchange, and financial obligation. The assembled crowd has negotiated a resolution that involves multiple currencies, various barter arrangements, and several forms of credit that exist only in community memory and mutual trust. And you're watching it all unfold, increasingly aware that medieval people didn't just live with economic uncertainty, they had developed sophisticated systems for functioning within that uncertainty, creating financial relationships that prioritized community survival over individual profit while somehow managing to keep everyone fed, housed, and reasonably satisfied with their economic arrangements. As the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, painting the tavern's grimy windows with deceptively beautiful amber light, the atmosphere inside shifts from raucous afternoon entertainment to something altogether more sinister. Medieval people, you're about to discover, had excellent reasons for avoiding travel after dark. And most of those reasons are currently gathering in the shadows around the tavern like vultures circling wounded prey. The cheerful chaos of daytime drinking gives way to the kind of tension that makes every patron check their weapons and eye the exits, because nightfall in medieval times wasn't just darker, it was actively dangerous in ways that would horrify anyone accustomed to modern street lighting and police protection. The first sign of trouble comes when a stranger enters the tavern wearing a hood that conceals his face and carrying the kind of walking staff that could double as a weapon without anyone noticing until it was too late. Medieval people had developed sophisticated systems for evaluating potential threats, and this particular arrival triggers every warning signal that experience had taught them to recognize. The stranger's clothes are well made but deliberately nondescript. His movements suggest combat training, and his eyes scan the room with the professional assessment of someone who's calculating escape routes and evaluating potential obstacles. Evening, friends. The stranger announces with the kind of forced cheerfulness that medieval people understood meant exactly the opposite. His greeting receives the cautious responses of people who've learned that friendly strangers after dark are often neither friendly nor strangers, but rather advanced scouts for less pleasant companions who prefer to conduct their business under cover of darkness. The tavern keeper's hand drifts toward his cudgel with the automatic response of someone who's seen this particular scenario play out too many times, usually ending with property damage and customer casualties. The stranger's presence immediately changes the social dynamics of the tavern. As conversations become quieter and various patrons begin positioning themselves closer to weapons that had been decorative during daylight hours but were rapidly becoming practical necessities. Medieval taverns at night transformed from community gathering places into potential battlegrounds where survival depended on quick thinking, faster reflexes, and the ability to distinguish between legitimate travelers and professional criminals who specialized in late-night robbery. Old Henrik's war stories take on new relevance as he begins sharing tales of nighttime encounters that emphasize practical survival techniques rather than heroic adventure. His advice includes detailed instructions about sleeping arrangements that minimize vulnerability, strategies for traveling safely after dark, and methods for distinguishing between ordinary dangers and the kind of supernatural threats that medieval people genuinely believed emerged with sunset. Henrik's stories reveal the complex relationship between medieval people and darkness, where practical fears about human predators combined with supernatural concerns about creatures that avoided daylight. The supernatural element of medieval nighttime fears becomes apparent when Crazy Mary begins muttering about the approaching hour when the barriers grow thin and things that should stay buried begin to walk. Medieval people understood that darkness brought not only human dangers, but also supernatural threats that required different kinds of preparation and protection. Mary's prophecies about nighttime activities include warnings about vengeful spirits, demonic influences, and various creatures that medieval folklore insisted became active after sunset, creating layers of fear that went far beyond concerns about ordinary criminals. The stranger's true intentions become clearer when he begins making casual inquiries about the day's financial transactions, particularly William the Miller's mysterious prosperity and the various payment arrangements that had resolved the afternoon's legal disputes. Medieval bandits operated sophisticated intelligence networks that tracked potential victims and valuable cargo, making taverns natural information-gathering points for criminals who specialized in relieving travelers of their wealth. The stranger's questions reveal knowledge of the day's events that suggests either supernatural insight or very earthly connections to people who make their living from other people's misfortune. William the Miller's reaction to the stranger's inquiries reveals his own understanding of medieval criminal economics, where displaying wealth inevitably attracted unwanted attention from people who viewed other people's prosperity as personal opportunity. His responses become increasingly evasive as he attempts to downplay his recent financial success while avoiding outright lies that could be easily disproven by witnesses who'd observed the day's transactions. Medieval people had developed sophisticated techniques for appearing poor while actually possessing wealth, creating elaborate deceptions designed to avoid becoming targets for robbery or extortion. The tavern keeper announces that he's closing the common room for the night, but his tone suggests this is less about normal business hours and more about preventing his establishment from becoming a crime scene. Medieval tavern keepers understood that their businesses could be destroyed by violence that got out of hand, making them natural mediators who tried to prevent conflicts from escalating into the kind of carnage that would require expensive cleanup and unwanted attention from local authorities. His approach to the current tension involves strategic positioning that allows him to either mediate disputes or escape quickly, depending on how the situation develops. The closing announcement triggers a series of negotiations about sleeping arrangements that reveal the complex logistics of medieval overnight accommodation. The stranger requests a private room despite the obvious availability of cheaper common sleeping areas, suggesting either genuine wealth or professional requirements that prioritize privacy over economy. The other patrons begin making their own arrangements, with some choosing to sleep in the common area despite the obvious risks and others deciding that traveling in darkness might be safer than staying in a tavern that's attracting the wrong kind of attention. Brother Marcus offers to provide spiritual protection for the night through prayers and blessings designed to ward off both earthly and supernatural dangers. Medieval people understood that nighttime required spiritual preparation as well as physical precautions, creating elaborate rituals designed to protect against threats that couldn't be deterred through ordinary defensive measures. His blessing ceremony includes prayers for safe sleep, protection against evil influences, and various religious formulas that were believed to create spiritual barriers around sleeping areas. The spiritual protection preparations reveal the elaborate defensive measures that medieval people employed against nighttime dangers that went beyond ordinary human threats. Marcus's protective rituals include the placement of blessed objects around sleeping areas, the recitation of specific prayers at particular times, and various religious practices designed to maintain divine protection throughout the dangerous hours of darkness. Medieval people approached nighttime with the same careful preparation that modern people reserve for natural disasters, understanding that survival often depended on spiritual as well as physical defenses. Historians still argue whether medieval fears of supernatural nighttime dangers were genuine beliefs or practical metaphors for very real human threats, but the evidence suggests that medieval people made no clear distinction between the two categories. The assembled patrons prepare for night with defenses designed to address both bandits and demons, creating protective measures that combine practical security with spiritual warfare. Their approach to nighttime survival reflects a worldview where supernatural and natural dangers were equally real and equally lethal. The stranger's behavior becomes increasingly suspicious as he attempts to engage various patrons in conversations that seem designed to extract information about their travel plans, wealth, and defensive capabilities. Medieval criminals operated systematic approaches to victim selection that involved careful intelligence gathering about potential targets, making casual conversation a professional tool for identifying profitable opportunities. His questions about tomorrow's travel routes, planned destinations, and protective escorts reveal the kind of detailed planning that distinguished professional bandits from ordinary opportunistic criminals. The information-gathering process reveals the sophisticated criminal networks that operated throughout medieval Europe, where professional thieves maintained detailed intelligence about trade routes, wealthy travelers, and local defensive capabilities. The stranger's knowledge of regional conditions, current political situations, and various travel hazards suggests connections to organized criminal enterprises that operated with the efficiency of legitimate businesses while specializing in distinctly illegitimate activities. A second stranger arrives just as the first one's questioning becomes uncomfortably direct, and the two men exchange glances that suggest prior acquaintance and coordinated planning. Medieval bandit operations often involved advanced scouts who identified targets and gathered intelligence while accomplices positioned themselves for optimal tactical advantage. The arrival of the second stranger transforms the tavern's atmosphere from merely tense to actively threatening, as the assembled patrons realize they're potentially trapped in a building with professional criminals who've had time to plan their approach. The tactical situation becomes clear when more strangers begin arriving in ones and twos, each taking positions that would control escape routes while maintaining the pretense of being ordinary travelers seeking accommodation. Medieval bandit tactics involved surrounding targets while maintaining plausible deniability until the moment of actual attack, creating situations where victims couldn't be certain of criminal intent until it was too late to escape or organize effective resistance. The tavern gradually fills with men whose casual demeanor can't quite disguise their professional interest in everyone else's wealth and defensive capabilities. The assembled patrons begin making their own tactical preparations as they recognize the developing threat, with weapons becoming more visible and conversations shifting toward practical discussions of defensive strategies. Medieval people who survived to adulthood had necessarily developed skills in recognizing and responding to criminal threats, creating informal cooperation networks that activated automatically when communities faced external dangers. The afternoon's social divisions disappear as everyone realizes they're potentially facing a situation where survival requires collective defense against professional predators. The tavern keeper makes a final announcement about closing time that everyone understands is actually a warning about the approaching crisis, giving legitimate customers final opportunities to escape before the situation deteriorates beyond peaceful resolution. His tone carries the weight of someone who's seen similar scenarios play out with varying degrees of violence and property damage, making his warnings both practical advice and desperate pleas for everyone to avoid turning his establishment into a battlefield that would destroy his livelihood and possibly end his life. As darkness settles fully over the medieval landscape and the last honest travelers seek safety behind barred doors and shuttered windows, the tavern becomes a microcosm of everything that made medieval life dangerous after sunset. The assembled criminals begin dropping their pretenses while the legitimate patrons prepare for violence that seems increasingly inevitable, creating a confrontation that will test every survival skill that medieval life had taught them. And you're trapped in the middle of it all, increasingly aware that the romantic notion of medieval adventure is about to collide with the brutal reality of medieval survival, where the difference between living to see tomorrow and becoming another cautionary tale depends on decisions that must be made in the next few minutes, with consequences that will determine whether your brief journey into medieval life ends in escape or disaster. The soft sounds of night settling over the countryside are punctuated by the distant howl of wolves, the creak of settling timber, and the whispered conversations of people who understand that they're about to discover whether their medieval survival skills are sufficient for the challenges that darkness brings. The tavern's cheerful daytime chaos has transformed into something altogether more primitive and dangerous, where every shadow could conceal a threat and every stranger might be the last person you ever meet. The medieval world is about to reveal why people who lived in it developed such elaborate defenses against the darkness, and why modern people who think they understand historical hardship might want to reconsider their romantic notions about the good old days, because the good old days are about to demonstrate exactly why they weren't actually good at all. As you sit in the growing darkness of this medieval tavern, surrounded by the mounting tensions of a world without modern safety nets, you begin to understand why people in the 14th century lived such brief, brutal lives. Every aspect of medieval existence that seemed quaint or charming from the safe distance of modern life reveals itself as a constant battle against forces that could destroy you without warning or mercy. The food that could poison you, the water that could kill you, the medicine that might cure you or might accelerate your death, the justice that operated without logic or fairness, the economic system that could bankrupt you overnight, and now the darkness that brought threats you were never trained to handle. The romantic notion of simpler times dissolves like morning mist as you realize that medieval people didn't live simpler lives. They lived infinitely more complex and dangerous lives that required skills, knowledge, and survival instincts that modern people have forgotten how to develop. Every meal was a gamble. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every transaction could lead to financial ruin. And every sunset brought dangers that could end your story before you learned how to write it properly. The tavern grows quiet now, except for the whispered plans of people preparing for whatever the night might bring. The fire burns low, casting dancing shadows that seem to move with their own malevolent purpose. Outside, the medieval world settles into the kind of darkness that swallows sound, hope, and unwary travelers with equal efficiency. You close your eyes and let the sounds of this long-ago night wash over you: the settling timber, the distant wolves, the quiet conversations of people who understand that survival is never guaranteed and comfort is always temporary. In this moment between day and night, between safety and danger, between the familiar and the utterly foreign, you finally understand why you wouldn't last a day in a medieval tavern. It's not just about the food, the hygiene, or the entertainment. It's about living in a world where every single aspect of existence required skills you never learned and knowledge you never needed, where survival was a daily achievement rather than a basic assumption, and where the margin between life and death was measured not in years or months but in moments of good judgment and pure luck. Sleep well, knowing that your worst day in the modern world is infinitely safer than the best day in a medieval tavern, and dream peacefully of a time when the biggest decisions you face tomorrow involve coffee choices rather than survival strategies. The medieval world awaits in your dreams, but when you wake, you'll return to a world where darkness brings sleep rather than terror, where strangers are generally harmless, and where the greatest adventure you'll face is deciding what to watch on Netflix. Sweet dreams, time traveler. You've survived your day in medieval history, which is more than many people who actually lived it could say.